Good evening, everyone. I'm Deborah Carden. I'm the BMI's Director of Development, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to this special members only program. We're excited to bring you this behind the scenes experience of our garment loft, which has been made possible thanks to your generous membership support. I'd like to turn the program over now to my colleague, the BMI's Director of Collections, Jane Walterek, who's going to talk a little bit more about our museum's collection and also introduce this evening's guest speaker. I did just want to let you know that we have saved time at the end of the program for questions and answers. So please feel free to use the Q&A box if you have any questions or any comments you'd like to share, and we will be sure to get to that at the end of the program. So thanks again for joining us. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Jane.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jane Walterek, Director of Collections and Exhibitions at the Baltimore Museum of Industry. And I am delighted to be with you to introduce our speaker, Debbie Farthing. Tonight, we are going to talk about costumes. The BMI's garment collection has quite a variety of clothing and accessories representing Maryland's clothing manufacturers and local designers. We have work uniforms, sample prototypes, and lots of custom-made clothing. Joseph Banks, Mary Garden, Katzenberg, Icy Isaacs, Jeanette Beck, and Pauline Trigere are just a few of the makers in our collection. I have the distinct pleasure of working with Debbie Farthing for over 15 years. When I began working at the BMI in 2014, I discovered we had a garment collection and immediately called Debbie, knowing her depth of knowledge in this area. At first, she curated an exhibit called Baltimore Shops for our temporary exhibit gallery, but since then, she's focused on curating exhibits for our garment loft window display. This exhibit is curated and rotated every 8 to 12 months by Debbie, pulling garments and objects from our vast collection. In addition to her work at the BMI, Debbie is a part-time graduate student at UMBC, pursuing her master's degree in public history, and works part-time for the Gibson Island Historical Society. Tonight, she's going to tell us about her most recent exhibit, Women at Work, giving you a little behind the scenes peek at how she researches and develops new installations for the BMI. So without further ado, take it away, Debbie.
Good evening, thank you. Give me just a moment to share my screen. All right, if you can't see this, please let me know. But good evening and thank you for coming, so to speak. When I came to the BMI, it was only supposed to be for a few days. And now, as Jane says, it's been 7 years. I became so fascinated with the collections in general, I couldn't leave. The collections as a whole at the BMI are vast and fascinating. And the clothing collection in particular holds some real treasures and opportunities to share some great stories of Baltimore. When we think of workwear, we often think of uniforms. Uniforms do more than identify someone as a worker. They often identify what kind of work someone does, such as a member of the military, the medical field, the food service industry, or heavy industry. Sometimes it's insignia that tells us where someone works, but they all serve to identify these as working clothes, not our personal clothing. I personally believe that what we wear is who we are as individuals, a culture, or a society. Often workwear has not been about choice, but people often find ways to personalize it. But either way, these garments help us to tell stories about the people and companies of Baltimore. I want to take a moment here to discuss the clothing collections at the Baltimore Museum of Industry. They have a quite large and varied collection, which might surprise some people. But considering that Baltimore was home to numerous aspects of the fashion industry, perhaps it's not all that surprising. Many of us are familiar with the men's hat industry, which included the big three of Baltimore, M.S. Levy, Townsend and Grace, and Brigham Hopkins. which in the 1890s sold millions of dollars. This is millions of dollars in 1890s dollars of men's straw hats all over the world. Others of you may be familiar with the umbrella companies of Poland Cats and Beelers. And Beeler, these two dominated umbrella manufacturing. There was also Mary Garden, which made a lot of those gym uniforms we all wore, and Howard Uniform Company. Hess Shoes, ties by Resisto and Schrader. Schrader patented several types of ties. Men's socks from C&M Mills, coats by London Fog, ladies' hats by countless milliners across Baltimore, including Jason's of Howard Street and Jeanette's, plus the many independent seamstresses, tailors, hatters, and milliners. And we can't forget the salespeople, tailors, and seamstresses who worked in the department stores like Hutzler's, Heck's, Hoschel Kohn, and Stewart's, among others. The garment industry was central to Baltimore's economy, and it was a great loss when these companies shut down or moved away. The companies I mentioned are just a drop in the bucket in what is at the BMI. As I'm sure you are all aware, putting together an exhibit involves more than just putting out some objects. For me, the process starts with the garments which inspire an idea. But that's just the beginning. A lot of decisions have to be made about how it's going to look. The theme, what objects to put in there, what goes on the walls, writing of text panels and labels. It's a long list. Knowing you have to put something that catches and holds visitors' attention in that empty space can be very daunting. The garment loft window is about 13 feet wide and not quite 3 feet deep. It's a space that can hold a lot of objects, but is also rather tight to maneuver in. So it has its own advantages and disadvantages. I'd like to go back a couple of previous windows, garment windows, to show you the process. The first window I ever did showed off garments from Baltimore stores and manufacturers, such as this suit jacket from T.I. Swartz & Sons, a Marines uniform from Haas, a gym uniform by Katzenberg Brothers, and a coat dress from Hutzler's. These installations are a real team effort. Ideas come from the garments I work with. I take them to Jane and others in the collections and archives department, and we settle on a theme which then gets approval from our director. The choice of garments is usually mine, but Connie Matrick-Hardy, one of the department volunteers, is a real help in making those decisions. What goes on the back wall is also a huge part of our process. It must relate to the garments, and the forms need to be placed so that they do not block texts and signs. This particular panel was created by an intern about the history and possible future of the Baltimore garment industry. I'd like to share two quick stories about this window. One day when I was at the BMI, I came across a woman looking at the garments, and she was in tears. She told me her grandfather had been in the Marines, and this uniform reminded her of him and how much she missed him. The green gym uniform, consisting of a short dress and little bloomers, also brought back a lot of memories to many of our female visitors who wore them in the past. When visitors connect in ways like this, I know I have done my job properly. Preparing the garment forms is the most time-consuming part of the exhibit. Each form has to be fitted to the garment, not the other way around. We do not alter garments. We have to find a form that's the right size and then pad it out, add needed supports, and then cover the whole thing with stockinette to hold all the padding and protect the garment. Stockinette is a tube knit fabric, and it comes in various widths that can cover things like arms or the entire form. I am particularly proud of this form, which was made for the coat dress from Hutzler's. Sorry for the glare, but this is the dress. And I had to create a period correct bust line and then a petticoat-like structure to hold out the skirt. I used and archival foam sheeting for the arms, and then posed her with her hands in the pockets of the dress. This served two purposes. One, to show that the dress had pockets, yay, and two, to hide the fact I had not made hands for her. The under petticoat that I created was made out of long industrial zip ties, duct tape, and twill tape. It's I think quite an engineering feat that I pulled off, and it took me about a week to make this form and get it right. Even undressed, I think this form has a certain beauty, and it's probably my favorite of all the ones I have created. In 2016, the BMI received a large donation of garments, hats, and jewelry from Helen Delich Bentley. She gave us such wonderful items, we decided the next window would be about her. Every new installation is created while the current one is still on this display. So we don't have the actual garment window to work with when deciding what goes where. So we tape out the dimensions on the floor of the collections department, as you can see from the blue tape, and create the layout from there. Here is the trial layout of Helen's garments and her fabulous hats. Some people had doubts as to whether we could get all of that in the window, but we made it work. The second garment from the left is a dress with a matching coat, and I decided I wanted to show the dress under the coat. Here you can see me adjusting the coat. I carefully stitched twill tape to the inside of the coat and then tied it in back under the coat so I could then adjust how much the coat was open so we could see the dress. You can also see here the hats on their stands. It took a while to figure out how to get each hat to sit just right on its stand. The picture on the right shows some of the stands without the hats on them so you can see what we were working with. We used tissue paper to pad out the hats so they would stay on the form, but the tissue paper showed and was very distracting. We ended up sewing black linings into many of the hats to hide the tissue paper, and then covered the top of most of the hat stands with black wig caps, so the padding and support disappeared in the final installation. In the days and weeks leading up to installation day, all of the dress forms are dressed and the other objects prepared. Here you can see the forms with covers to protect them, as well as boxes of other objects and supplies we would need that we've carried downstairs from the collections department to the garment loft so we can install the new window. It usually only takes about 30 minutes to remove an old installation, but then everything must be returned upstairs to be put away. We then start the process of undressing the forms, inspecting the clothing to make sure that it hasn't been damaged from the exhibit. Clothing is particularly sensitive to light, but we make every effort to keep the light at the proper levels. And then we return everything to storage. Having each item marked with a unique object number helps us quickly find where the objects belong and to keep track of all of our objects in the database. Here's the final installation with the 4 garments, a dozen hats, and other props, including an umbrella that our fabulous shop volunteer, John Reuter, made a holder for so we could pair it with that particular dress. John made several stands and pedestals for us as well to put hat stands on and raise up one of the forms. Included in Helen's donation were photographs of her wearing some of the garments. She wore the dress on the far left for an episode of her TV show in the 1960s. And in that episode, she talked about the Poland Cats Umbrella Company. The BMI, fortunately, also has a large collection of umbrellas from Poland Cats, and we were able to match up a very similar umbrella with that dress. After the Helen Bentley exhibit, we did one on men's work clothing, Dressed for Work, which inspired our Women at Work exhibit. Working so closely with the clothing collection really inspires me. And there's so many items I would love to share with everyone. And it's difficult to narrow it down to just the right pieces each time. I knew we could present a really eye-catching and educational exhibit to honor women in 2019, which was the Year of the Woman. While I was choosing the garments, I decided I wanted to put photographs of women at work across the 20th century in as many different jobs as I could on the back wall. Fortunately, the BMI has a collection of thousands of photographs taken by BG&E of all kinds of places they supplied with electricity. And paired with the incredible depth of other materials at the BMI, I had more than I could ever wish for from which to choose. Excuse me. With the help of Matt Sherko, our archivist, and others from the department, I chose factory workers at the Hess Shoe Factory. I'm not sure if you can see it, but the floor supervisor here is a woman. Office workers and sales ladies like this one from the BG&E store. Telephone operators, World War II shipyard workers, and waitresses. We all love this photograph of the shipyard worker so much that she became the sort of mascot of this exhibit. At that time, work clothes like these weren't made for women, so most women had to adapt men's clothing. If you look closely at her hat, you can see several pins on the brim. These are patriotic and sweetheart pins. Many of the pins were often red, white, and blue, or were in the shape of a V for victory. She has one in the shape of an airplane and another with an eagle. Another is heart-shaped and may have been for a husband or a son or another loved one. We chose factory workers, a TV interviewer, and a hairdresser. We chose nurses, teachers, and lab technicians. And women filling traditionally male roles, such as the BG&E meter reader, a female biplane pilot, and the first female engineer hired by Bendix. That's Pat Webb, and she was hired in the 1960s. And of course, I had to include Baltimore's own burlesque star and owner of the 2 O'Clock Club, Blaze Starr. Out of the hundreds of photographs I looked at, I eventually chose 41 photos that were made into a mural that covers the back wall. Here you can see it as it's being installed. As I chose the garments for the exhibit, I wanted to pick items that mirrored what was in the photographs. Even in the factories, women often wore what looked like their own regular clothes. On the left, I started with a dress from the 1910s to represent women who worked both in and out of the home. The next dress was made by the Mary Garden Company that could have been either for home use or in the workplace. I added an apron and a cap, which is tucked into the pocket of her apron, just like some of the factory photos. Factories would advertise that they were sanitary, and wearing aprons and caps helped reinforce that image. In the middle is an instantly recognizable white cotton nurse's uniform. This really groovy polyester jumpsuit represents a change to easy care fabrics, plus the increased acceptability of pants for women in the workplace. And finally, this jumpsuit, the manufacturer recommended this jumpsuit for factory workers and hairdressers. And then finally on the right, this prototype Joseph A. Banks suit for women from the 1980s oops, I don't know why that went. Let me go back. Shows the rise of more women in management positions and their need for more professional clothing. The lady tie came from Bendix, an interesting nod to professional women's clothing. And speaking of Joseph A. Bank, I want to acknowledge Harriet Bank, one of the founders of the BMI, who recently passed away. To keep track of each garment, its accessories, and any objects we add for atmosphere, we created a spreadsheet with the date of the object, the name of the object, its collection object number, a photograph of it, what other objects would be displayed with it, and text for the label. This helps make sure we have everything for each individual outfit and nothing gets forgotten. This has been especially helpful as the clothing has been changed out once already, and will be changed out again once the museum reopens. We also created a timeline so that everything was done and ready to go before our installation day. We needed to have images and text to the graphic designer so she could create our background mural, our text panels, and the labels. Once that was all approved, it went to the printer. Each step of the process had a deadline to keep us on track. For our late January installation, we started planning in August. Because this exhibit included the mural and we had to work with a graphic designer on it, it was more intensive than other exhibits I have done, and we really had to be on our toes. There were lots of moving parts to this one. As I talked about before, the fitting of dress forms is a time-consuming job, and this installation was no different. We always need to make sure we have enough dress forms of the right size to fit the garments I choose. I did have to switch out a couple of garments because we didn't have the right size forms for them. This particular form dates to the 1900s and was not in the best of shape. She was pretty beat up. With the help of Connie, we cleaned her up. We taped the torso of the form back together, covered it with batting, added more batting to fill out the bust line, and then put stockinette over it all. The stockinette makes it easier to adjust the amount of batting or whatever else we might use to make the form the right size and shape. And then it holds everything in place. It also protects the garment. Once we're satisfied with the fit, the stockinette is sewn closed to give it a nice, neat neckline. This time we tried a new technique for making arms. We made them out of pool noodles. They are archivally inert, easy to cut, and taped to make bends for elbows, and then easily shaped to fit to the shoulders. These are also covered in stockinette for a finished appearance. The final form, this is the final form, all dressed and ready to go to the window. I cut the end of the pool noodle to fit into the pocket. I used some twill tape tied around the other arm and then tied to the form. I had to kind of snake it through the placket of the dress to hold that arm in front. The piece of lace covers up the end of the arm and the twill tape. As I said before, all of the forms are dressed and accessorized before they are carried downstairs to the exhibit area. Some finishing touches are added though once they are installed. Excuse me, give me a moment. This is how the final installation looked for the first round of clothing. If you look closely, you might be able to see the tins added next to our factory worker, who is second from the left, and the tins are just to the right in the photograph. We added a hair dryer and some hairpins just to the left of the jumpsuit to dress her as a hairdresser. And we also put a briefcase next to our Joseph A. Banks suit. We also accessorized the nurse with a cap, pins, and a stethoscope. In choosing garments, not everything that's pulled makes the cut. I thought you'd like to see some of the things I didn't choose. Sometimes it's because it doesn't look good with the other garments, or I don't have the right form for it, or sometimes, well, no matter how interesting, such as the embellished jeans, it just doesn't work. As a side note, this blue nurse's uniform did make the cut for the third round of garments. So it will be showing up when we change the garments again. Because it's not good for clothing and textiles to be on display for too long, a second version of the exhibit was installed in July of 2019. This version includes a cotton dress with apron similar to the first installation, to our factory worker in the first installation. You may have noticed that this is a much larger dress than most of the others, and it helps lay to rest the notion that every woman in the past was much smaller than today. Second from the left is a very stylish pink waitress uniform made of a fabric that is very similar to a plastic tablecloth. I can't imagine what it was like to wear it. The green synthetic nurse's uniform again shows a turn towards easy care fabric. The jeans are paired with a 1776 pattern smock made to celebrate the bicentennial. That made it very easy to date it. And on the right is another Joseph A. Bank women's suit made of blue and white seersucker. The garments for the third version have already been chosen, and as I said, I will install them when the museum reopens to visitors. If you peek between the forms, you can see the mural and perhaps some of the pictures I showed earlier and a lot more. Each photo is labeled with the job, place of employment, year, and if we had it, the identity of the woman. The Women at Work installation has been my favorite so far, but I am already planning for what comes next. Sorry, no spoilers, it's a secret. Thank you for tuning in today. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Debbie. That was really fascinating.
Thank you.
Not often we get to see how an exhibit comes to life, and just really appreciated all those wonderful details. So yes, now we come to the Q&A portion of our evening. So please let us know if you have any questions for Debbie about the garment loft window. Jane is also available if you have anything more specific about our collections that you'd like to know. Maybe while we're waiting for people to start asking, Debbie, one thing I just learned when we were talking before the program started is that you're also a collector of garments. Can you tell us a little bit about like what inspired your passion for vintage?
So my mother was an antiques dealer and appraiser, and I had learned to sew as a child. She taught me when I was probably 5 or 6, and I've sewn pretty much ever since then. So I think that those two things combined really did create my interest in at least antiques and then vintage clothing. I wore a vintage wedding dress from 1910 when my husband and I got married, which I am proud to say that both my daughter and my daughter-in-law wore the veil to my dress when they both got married in the last year. So I think that I come by it honestly. I also have that mutant collecting gene. If you have it, you understand. If you don't, you don't. But I do find clothing just fascinating. There are so many things that clothing can tell us. And I love being able to do that research and bring those stories out.
Thank you. I see we're starting to get some questions. One of the questions is if you can talk a little bit, I know you mentioned this during your presentation about how often you need to change out the textiles.
We do try to do it, like Jane said, every 8 to 12 months. Again, because of light issues. Light can really do a lot of damage to clothing and textiles, but we do a very good job of controlling our light levels. Also, I choose garments that are sturdy. I would never pick anything that could not withstand being put onto the forms and being put on display. So that is another factor that goes into what I choose goes into the window. There have been some things that we really wanted to put up and just could not because they are not in good enough condition to be shown like that.
Thank you.
So, like I said, we've tried, like I said, every 6, 8, 12 months with the, unfortunately with the museum closed, it's been a little longer for this second round, but hopefully soon we'll be getting onto the third round with this exhibit.
And there's another question about how the garments are stored when they aren't on display. I don't know, Jane, I know you're very much involved in our, making sure that everything's properly stored when it's not on display. Maybe you could address that?
Sure, be happy to. So we do have what we call a climate control storage room. and the garments are packed away in either boxes, acid-free boxes, and acid-free tissue. We do also have a rack where we hang some of the garments because the garment box, sometimes the garments are just too big for a box. The boxes are also expensive, and they do take up shelving space. So we have a rack, a hanging rack, and the garments that are put on hangers are put on special hangers. Again, Connie Matricardi helps us with this, where the hangers are padded out very thickly and again, covered with the stockinette. So their shoulders are well supported. Gravity plays against us, which is another reason why we don't keep things on the forms in the windows for too long because of gravity, as well as light. But that's pretty much it. Hats and hat boxes. So it's basically on a rack or in a box in a climate controlled storage.
Thanks. Thanks, Jane. And here's another interesting question about collaboration. Someone's wondering if museums collaborate with their fashions collections. Specifically, we have somebody who's joining with us who's been giving tours at the Maryland Center for History and Culture called Spectrum of Fashion. And Debbie, I know you're very familiar with that exhibit.
I am.
To that? Yeah. I mean, has there been any collaboration where we share things or, in any other way work together?
So with the Maryland Center, I don't think that we've ever loaned them anything from our clothing collection, mostly because their clothing collection is extensive and incredible. And their previous curator, Alexandra Deutsch, and now Allison Tolman, really just did a fabulous job of making sure that the clothing collection really kind of came out of the dark and back into prominence. So the Spectrum of Fashion exhibit everything is from their collections. They really wanted to show what they have. I did, however, a couple of months ago, do a presentation for them on our window, kind of the same, a version of the same presentation I just gave tonight. But I did put in some interesting things from their collection to kind of tie in what I was talking about.
Thank you. Someone else has asked where the window is located in the museum. Jane, you want to talk a little bit about sort of the setup?
Sure. So from the front lobby, as you come into the museum, there's a wall in front of you, and kind of on the flip side of that wall, we have what we call our streetscape. And on the streetscape, we have the garment loft and our print shop. So it's relatively easy to find. It's very central to the museum.
Thank you. And this question I think is really interesting. Someone wants to know, Debbie, if you're ever able to interview individuals whose clothing you use, just to find out the stories behind them.
We haven't so far. I wish we could. I think the closest that we've come is all of the information that Helen Bentley gave us when she donated. She donated so much. It is really, really quite incredible. And I know that Helen was really famous for her hats, and we were donated hundreds of them. So it was really quite incredible to see that. But she did also give us the photographs. And in the photographs, she described where she was and what she was doing and who she was with. So that's about as close as we've come. We've had a couple of other donors who have given us written scripts of the clothing. I would just right before the pandemic, a man came in with a suit, and I was just dying to interview him because he had a really, really interesting story. But unfortunately, we have not been able to get back to that because of everything being closed.
And a lot of our collection actually came from the companies themselves. So actually have not been worn yet. So they're right sort of from the factory, you might say. But we do have some oral histories of some of the clothing companies as well.
Jane, what is the oldest garment in our collection? Do you know the answer to that? Or Debbie, do you know?
You stumped me.
I think the thing that I have seen is there is a lady's bodice from a Baltimore seamstress, and it dates to the 1890s. That is the one item that sticks out in my head as being the oldest.
That would have been my guess, around 1900.
Yeah.
Wow. Amazing to think that, somebody thought that was worth saving. That's just wonderful. We've also got some questions about, you talked a lot about the women's garment collection. Can you talk a little bit about our collection of men's apparel? What sorts of things we have?
It's actually pretty extensive. I'm really excited to say it's very extensive. We have quite a few suits from different tailors and different manufacturers across Baltimore. There might be an exhibit being planned about tailors in Baltimore coming in the future. They're really, really fascinating, and they're really interesting. We have a lot of men's shoes. We have literally hundreds of men's ties. And the variety is astonishing, as well as some of the patents that were issued for these men's ties. We have men's hats, we have men's shoes, we have men's socks from the 1930s that are really, really fascinating, far more colorful and patterned than you might expect. No plain black or brown socks for these men, not at all. So it is really quite extensive. We probably have as much for men as we do for women, to be honest.
Lots of work uniforms too.
Yes.
And somebody else asked if we're planning to highlight the men's uniform industry in Baltimore, which I know one of your previous iterations did focus on uniforms. So that is something that we have done.
Yes.
But it sounds like we've got a lot of representation in the collection if we wanted to revisit.
Yes.
So here's another interesting question. Someone wants to know if there have been any interesting findings within your overall interest or research that reveal particular difficulties that women may have gone through during the time that is reflected through their clothing.
So that is a very interesting question. I got to think about that for a second. I think that what we find, one of the things that I found really interesting is some of looking at women in the factories in the early 1900s. And it looks like they're literally wearing their own clothes. And I'm sure they are. But then you look at some of the machinery that they're working around, and I don't wonder if there must have been dangers of getting their clothing caught if you're wearing the longer dresses that women were wearing in the early 1900s and the longer sleeves. Often they weren't issued anything by their employer. So it was up to them to come up with anything protective. Although in the one photo that you showed, the Pompeian, from the Pompeian olive oil line, that they did have little caps on to protect their hair, but it was probably to keep hair from getting into whatever they were making that day. Other things that I found, such as switching from everything being all cotton to being synthetics, and clothes being, the fabrics being easier to care for. And that became a really, really big deal starting in about the 50s, when we're starting to see women come out of the factories or out of World War II, but they still want to go to work. And there's so many things that they want to do, that there is an emphasis on easy to care, easy to wear fabrics. And then the acceptance of pants, and it's really not until the 60s and into the 70s that pants become acceptable. for everyday wear and then at work. Work was a huge deal. I think there are some of us who remember, not being able to wear pants at work or being very limited in that, and not being able to wear pants to school. I have some friends who, even in the 70s, their schools did not allow them to wear pants. So we do see some of that reflected, some of those difficulties reflected in the clothing.
Thank you. Yeah, some gave us a lot to think about there. Here's a great question. Jane, I think this one's for you. Is the museum accepting clothing donations? And if so, what types of things are we looking for?
Oh, that is a good question. We would certainly consider and entertain any donation of any kind, not just clothing. Every donation is researched and is looked at on a case-by-case basis. So it would depend on what it is, the story that it tells, if it was made locally, either by a clothing company or manufacturer or designer or tailor. It depends on the story. As everyone knows, that the BMI is a storytelling museum. We tell stories about workers and manufacturing and industry in Maryland. So that's our focus. So as long as it sort of fits in within that criteria, we certainly would consider it.
Let's see. I just got one more. Oh, this isn't a question, but this is a cute follow-up comment to Debbie. You were talking about the change in mores when women could start wearing pants, and someone wrote, when I was a freshman in college in 1968, we were required to wear skirts to dinner. No dress code for the men, however. Women had to sign in and out of the dorms at night. Men, no. Thanks for sharing.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting to see how so much of like societal norms are reflected in clothing. Very interesting.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I think we have gone through most of the questions. Oh, here's just another interesting comment. Thanks for the great presentation. Somewhat poignant when work has been so different and or at home this past year. I think that's really absolutely a very valid point. And to think about what our museum will tell about the way people dress this year.
I was going to say, I saw Lori's comment. I was just going to say maybe we should collect sweatpants and leggings and what is it? What do people call it? The Zoom suit, where you've just got something nice from here up, and you could be wearing whatever on the bottom half. That and slippers, I think.
Absolutely. Yes.
Or masks. I think masks would be a fascinating subject to really research. Everybody who's all these different masks that people have been wearing and making, and I find them fascinating. I love looking at people's masks and what they say, and I can't stop buying them because I just think some of them are so funny. But I think that would make a really, really interesting addition to our collections and a possible exhibit down the road, maybe when we're all past our mask,
right, somewhere down the road.
Yeah, somewhere down the road when we're not,
We're ready to see them in exhibit cases.
Right.
That would be a good thing. Oh, well, Debbie, thank you so much. This is
You're
just
welcome.
been such a treat. Jane, thank you for joining us. I'm really delighted that so many of you took time from this evening to be with us. We are truly so grateful to our members, especially this past year. Your support has really meant a world of difference to us, so thank you. We will be posting a recording of tonight's program, so if you'd like to share it with some of your friends who missed it, it will be on the BMI member webpage in the coming weeks. Also, we would love to hear from you if you have any questions, if you have any suggestions for future programs, topic stories you'd like to hear, please contact my colleague Lori Ferrara. I believe someone will put her information in the chat so you can reach right out to her and let us know what you'd like from us. And we do look forward to hopefully welcoming you back to the BMI soon. We miss you. Thanks, everybody.
Da 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 da.